Aloha and welcome to Allen Connections. I'm Brahim Audi. Trump, politics for a new century. This is the topic, and we have Professor Cynthia Franklin from the Department of English at UH Manoa to discuss that with us. And we also have Professor Noel Kent from the Department of Ethnic Studies. Thank you both for coming over. And okay, I mean, what does that tell you? I mean, just the title, Trump, Politics for a New Century. Would you like to say what that means for you?
I think what I find newest about Trump is not so much his anti-immigration policies, not so much his support for Zionism, not so much his desire to strip women of all control over their bodies, not so much his desire to benefit corporations and strip working people of their rights. These are part of a kind of concerted set of attacks that we've seen over the past decades. What I find to be most new and alarming is, first of all, that there is what seems to me fascistic elements to his presidency that you could see during his candidacy and that seem to be in full force in this first week as he's imposing bans on arresting reporters for covering protest, as he is coming up with this new thing we have called alternative facts, the kind of rhetorics of hate and no fig leaf over things that are profoundly undemocratic. Those things seem to me new and very frightening. So I think this kind of not dressing up policies that Republicans have long sponsored that are racist, that are sexist, that are colonialist, but instead saying, that's what we are, that's who we are, deal with it. That's what seems new to me and quite alarming.
Yeah. Alternative facts, you know, I mean, what is that? I never heard of it until Trump's, you know. So what does that tell you? And also, you know, the title itself.
It's just very dangerous because basically if we're in the so-called post-truth era, it means that basically we don't believe in any truth. And if we don't believe in any truth, then we don't have any trust. And there's nothing one can believe. And therefore, how do we relate to each other? How do we relate as a community of human beings? How do we maintain a democratic society? The Trump election throws all of this into question. You know, it really creates. I mean, all these issues I thought had been settled. You know, I'm 72 years old. I thought a lot of issues had been settled a long time ago, such as women's rights and voting rights, and you know, all kinds of other issues. That the climate change was real, and that we needed to vigorously enforce, you know, new regulations to reduce fossil fuel consumption. All of that suddenly is not been settled. Suddenly it's open again, and this is really frightening because I thought we had passed that point in this country, and the fact that millions and millions of voters, because of their own fears, their own insecurities, their own resentments, their xenophobia, their racism, also feel obliged to vote for a person whose character was very amply revealed during the election also makes me very uneasy that Americans are willing to vote for somebody who not only is inexperienced but is a highly narcissistic, perhaps mentally unstable individual. You know, and this creates a real worry.
Yeah. Well, Cindy mentioned you know, fascistic elements and so forth. So. That you know, as you know, like raises the question. Okay, I mean, the American people are not fascistic, you know, or fascist or something, you know. How come you know, he got to become president? He won the elections.
You know, I worked for Obama in Ohio back in '08, and I was going door to door, and this was a place in Ohio that had been basically deindustrialized, and many mills had closed, and workers were, and going door to door talking to people, I got a sense that these blue collar workers felt really abandoned. They felt that nobody was in their corner, no one on their side. They felt that they could not trust any of the existing politicians, that they were looking for someone who would basically tell the truth about their situation and deliver them from the situation they were in, you know. And this has come home to roost in a certain sense. Part of the blame has to be, Trump basically is a product of our fears, our anxieties, and also the realities of a capitalist system which isn't working for millions and millions of Americans.
But those who voted for Trump because of all these things, I mean, in terms of the primaries especially, could have voted for Sanders. I mean, you know, they could have registered Democrat and voted for Sanders, you know. And I'm not sure, you know, the same thing in terms of the Sanders phenomena. Is it from the same roots, like as Trump's, as, you know, you talked about? So, well, what do you think? Like, why couldn't have they voted for Sanders, or more people voting for Sanders in the Democratic primary?
That's a complicated
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's like a
but
rhetorical,
one quick
yeah.
answer I have is that there was a media blackout around Sanders largely, and I felt like Sanders was everywhere, but that was because I get my news, you know, from I don't get my news from mainstream sources primarily, but the studies that showed how little coverage there was of Sanders. And, you know, the media has to take quite a bit of responsibility for giving Trump so much attention. He is largely a creation of the media, who now I think are recoiling from him, and I hope will be really hard on him through his presidency. But I think that Sanders's platform did not get the kind of attention that it deserved. And then I also think at the same time, the Democratic machinery was kind of out to destroy him. And there was, I think, kind of ignorance and fear-mongering about what his policies actually were, and people felt that he was going to attack what they had, the people who are, you know, more comfortably off. I think that it took him a while to get going in terms of reaching out to people of color. I don't think race was an issue that he was very good at addressing. I think he's very good on class, but I don't think he had very good intersectional analyses. And I'm not saying that Trump people were looking for intersectional analyses, but I think those were, you know, a combination of things that would have helped him build a better base. But honestly, I put most of the fault for that at the, you know, in terms of Sanders versus Clinton. I think the Democratic Party really put all their investments into Clinton and were very out of touch with how dissatisfied people were with business as usual. And then the Republicans, also dissatisfied, went for Trump.
And then another thing, perhaps, is like a lot of people who didn't like Hillary went for Trump. I mean, you know, there are people who voted for Sanders during the Democratic primaries, but then when he didn't win, they voted for Trump, you know, because he's like the outside candidate from this kind of situation, like the establishment situation and so on. But, you know, in terms of like the question of race and the intersectionality of race, class, gender, and all of that, I mean, a lot of women voted for Trump. I mean, what do we attribute that to? I mean, I'll ask you that one.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would point out that women of color did not vote for Trump. And the numbers of white women that voted for Trump, I think in some ways are magnified by the fact that people will say, what is it, 53% of white women voted for Trump. But if you look at how many people voted, you know, many, many people did not vote. And so I don't know what the exact percentage would be. When I get to that number, I frankly am confounded. And I think it is a disturbing register of how men and women both do not, we have a long way to go when it comes to feminism. I did see women wearing T-shirts saying he can grab my pussy. I don't know what to say about the fact that that was so trivialized by men too. And I think, again, the media coverage was really bad. To the extent that it was covered, it was headlined as him being lewd. He wasn't just lewd. He actually was, bragging about sexual assault.
Oh, yeah.
And to call that, kind of vulgar language is not the kind of framing that
Right.
that it required.
It's way beyond
And
that,
so I think that our whole society has, a problem when it comes to gender analysis. And at the same time, I would point to the Women's March and say that to me speaks much more to where women are at in relationship to Trump. And I think some women who voted really didn't know, perhaps the details. I checked with my class, and some of them had not seen
idea.
that clip. That was, I thought, everywhere, but in many ways it wasn't everywhere. And I think that he did his job at smearing Hillary Clinton via Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton was not doing a good job reaching out to people. So I think there were so many factors at work.
Yes.
But I would just say we have a ways to go when it comes to understanding the problems with misogyny, sexual violence, reproductive rights. And I think there are also people for religious reasons who oppose abortion who felt that was probably more important than Trump's sexism.
Yeah, especially when you have Pence as vice president and he's a Christian fundamentalist, hardcore right wing, but Christian fundamentalist. So he, brings a lot of these votes towards Trump, and they were not going to vote for Hillary anyway. But the thing is that I notice sometimes it is framed, or it used to be framed between Hillary and Trump, and even after Trump won the electoral college vote, still it's the Democratic Party wanted to use this to attack. To attack Trump's president. When he became president-elect, to attack him so that they can bring people towards the Democratic Party rather than the progressive movement trying to bring them somewhere else, which is more progressive than Hillary, who's like Wall Street lady, right? Not that Trump is not Wall Street and the rest of it, but that's how he portrayed himself against the establishment, etc. So what do you think of that kind of discussion?
I think we can't underestimate Trump. Trump's a masterful politician, and he and the people around him were able to conjure up this language that basically reflected the fears and the anxieties and the resentments that millions and millions of people have. And Hillary was the perfect candidate to run against him, because she was carrying all this baggage, and she was obviously an insider. She was very, very wealthy. She used her foundation to make huge amounts of money. There was a lot of resentment about Bill, still lingering among voters. So my sense is, and I may be wrong, that I think almost any other Democratic candidate who ran could basically have beaten Trump, and perhaps badly. But Trump's perfect opponent was Hillary Clinton. I think Joe Biden would have done very, very well against him, and I think Bernie, and I think Elizabeth Warren would have been a very formidable candidate. But
I actually don't think Elizabeth Warren would have gotten very far, because I think she's too bookish, and I think that gender had a lot to do with Hillary Clinton's demise. I think in the same way that people were not adequately disturbed by Trump's misogyny and being a sexual predator, they were also, I think that Clinton is someone I have a lot of problems with, but I think that that there was a huge amount of sexism directed against her candidacy, and I think she really suffered from that. I actually agree with you that I think Sanders could have beaten Trump. I think it's quite likely that he could have. Biden, I'm less sure about Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Like Sanders basically let it go, even in the primaries. When you said like he didn't see the intersectionality between race, class, and gender, especially race and class, so he didn't reach out for Latinos and African Americans.
Just not fast enough.
Yeah,
He
well,
got
yeah.
on,
I mean,
got
he
with
was
it,
late,
but just not fast enough.
But
yeah.
already, like the train had left the station, so to speak. So this is an interesting thing. But yet, I mean, Noel was talking about all these kind of problems that we have in the country. Rust Belt, yeah, factories moving out, etc. More like undocumented workers and so forth. So he comes with easy answers to these things, easy fixes. Build a wall and let them, we'll have them pay for it. He's not talking about Canada, he's talking about Mexico, you know what I'm saying? Why not build a wall, so in Canada? I mean, that's one thing. The other thing is that, get rid of the Obamacare because there's a better way of doing it, but he didn't tell you what, and he doesn't know what it is even now, yeah? So he has those kinds of easy fixes. I'm talking about get all these immigrants before in his early run, in the elections, all undocumented workers, get rid of them. He doesn't call them undocumented, illegal.
Illegals,
Yeah,
criminals,
yeah,
rapists.
criminals, rapists, etc. He should have included himself with that. But anyway, that's another matter. But what I'm saying basically then is these easy fixes people can relate to, especially when they are hurting, right? Yeah. But, and hurting from what? I mean, from the way globalization has been happening, that really wiped out a lot of American jobs and this and that. But then this is not because of Obama's policies or anybody's policies. This is because of the logic of globalization, capitalist globalization in terms of neoliberal kinds of policies globally. So could you speak something to that, which brought for us the question of all these, problems that people have been hurting from, and a lot of them voted for Trump because of that.
The country's lost 5 million manufacturing jobs in the last 10 years. I mean, those are, we're talking probably about 15 to 20 million people who are hurting because of that. We've got the jobs which have returned in manufacturing have been basically computerized and require much less personnel to man them. We've got a situation in which we now have huge numbers of people who are really disposable, or else working in the gig economy, working temporarily, being adjuncts, whatever else. We even see this in this university, the same thing happening, replacement by tenure, well-paid, benefit people who are tenured faculty with lecturers who are, really exploited in a lot of ways. So the economy has changed. Many people haven't recovered from the blowout in 08, and these are people who've lost their homes and have seen Goldman Sachs and other companies basically bailed out by the Democratic administration, and have been really angry about that, and feel that the elites benefit and then the people basically pay the price, which is true. I mean, so in that sense, they have an accurate perception of what's going on. Whether they're voting the right solution is something else. So we have terrific problems, and we've got on the horizon, we have robotics coming down, and we have a whole series of changes which will wipe out a huge number of working class jobs. So that a solution needs to be found for that. I mean, here we have Trump claiming that he's going to restore mining jobs and all kinds of other jobs which are gone forever. Absolutely gone. The whole industry is gone. So, basically people were voting for a fantasy rather than a reality which is really possible. And one can understand that and sympathize with that. But that's not taking us anyplace. It's taking us backwards.
But this also speaks again to the question that the progressive movement didn't have it together.
No.
I mean, you know, we were like, even like, I'm just gonna say like you worked for the Kerry campaign before and then the Obama campaign, etc., which was the right thing to do at that time. But you know, at the it's not a critique of you, but it's at the expense of like doing independent progressive politics away from the Democratic Party. Or how can you manage the doing work of the Democratic Party and progressive politics in such a way to, not have the right rise in the way it did given Trump, etc. And given what Cindy was saying in terms of the media, it's a culprit in this, and like they bumped him up big time, but in the wrong ways without paying much attention to the faux pas that he had. And these were not faux pas, but really, integral to his character and so forth, right? So.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that it's important to both view Trump with alarm as something new and to view him as a creation of all that has come before.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you look at what's happening with the Affordable Care Act, that's not all on him, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at how Democrats are receiving these absolutely horrific appointments that Trump is making, it should like, why are we having to petition people about Sessions?
Yes.
I mean, that should just not be something that we have to do. Why do we have to work so hard against somebody like DeVos? Where are why are we even having to make arguments to Democrats about this, let alone Republicans? And yet we are.
Yeah.
And I think that really speaks to the fact that we don't really have two parties.
No.
And I think some of the response in this election was precisely a desire to have something that isn't the establishment, that is this kind of, I'm exaggerating and saying we don't have two parties, but they are not sufficiently distinct when it comes to anything really other than reproductive rights and a few other things. They're pretty much the same, and Democrats they're normalizing Trump to an extent that I find quite alarming. I'm for the scientists that seem to be getting themselves really organized and saying, no, we're not going to be gagged. No, we're not going to deny climate change. I would like to see more of the Congress members and members of the Senate just taking a stand and saying no to all of this.
Yeah, but there's a precedent to that. I mean, during Reagan's time, when the Democrats had like control over Congress, they voted for all kinds of things that Reagan had suggested. So, in that sense, it is not two distinct parties, two different electoral parties, but not in terms of ideology. I mean, in the larger sense of ideology. Some might want to have like, supply side, or other ones, demand side. But this is like, different little thing. They are very little in terms of ideology. But the larger thing is they wanted to keep the capitalist globalizing system moving forward, and that's the idea. So there is a precedent for Democrats supporting, Reagan, Republicans, right?
And the magnitude of the marches, the last over the weekend, Friday and Saturday. I mean, we had 7,000 in Honolulu, and I've never seen the Hawaii State Capitol packed with people like that. And it was very jubilant. I would have preferred more of a maybe cutting edge to the politics, where people are really calling for various programs. But still, it gives us a sense of the vast outpouring of outrage and anger that exists in the country over the Trump presidency. And now what our job is basically is to, as political activists, is to mobilize that and drive it forward and really create a whole new movement, a progressive movement.
Different pole, yeah, exactly.
A whole new
away
progressive
from
movement.
the Democrats and the Republicans,
Definitely.
Because they are basically the same
Popular
thing,
movement,
globalized, they believe in this kind of capitalist globalization, etc., which is, in effect, and you mentioned the robotics and stuff, which is driven by the technology, like robotics and the computer and, this whole electronic technology that really wiped out a lot of jobs. Now, here the thing is not we must be or we should be against technology. It is who is in control of this technology. So it becomes the question of property and in whose benefit it is being employed. I mean, like there are corporations, global corporations, that made billions and billions of dollars in profit. And one thing, like it was interesting to me, like Samsung, South Korean, right? Despite all these problems with their, cell phone, they exploding, yeah. You know what the news mentioned that even with that, they had like $5 billion in profits. After they lost a lot of money.
Yeah.
So can you imagine if they hadn't had to pay for all of that? So meaning that these guys have profited, but the people who, a lot of them voted for Trump, did not profit. And that's why, as you mentioned, they voted for Trump, right? But here, in terms of intersectionality, like class and race, so a lot of white guys voted for Trump, thinking that it is the immigrant and the blacks and blah, 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 etc. Yeah? But then a new movement, rather than have it move towards fascism, this movement, a new movement can try to begin to attract those guys into this new progressive movement rather than this. So they have to deal with race questions, gender, and so forth, right?
Well, I mean, I actually think that the Occupy movement and then the Idle No More movement, the Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives, the Dakota Access Pipeline, I think those are hopeful things to me in terms of people getting very organized and working at grassroots levels. And, I think that I don't want to say that there's anything good about Trump's election, because I don't think there is. But it is going to mean that people are not going to be complacent and, just kind of go along with things. I mean, one of the things about Obama is he was so charming and his family was so lovely that you could forget that some of his policies were not lovely at all. They were pretty brutal.
Deportations.
Deportations of
Drones.
immigrants,
He
drones,
deported a lot of people.
assassinations, all of that.
But with a smile.
And support for Wall Street.
Yeah.
But he was so likable, so charming, and so decent in his everyday
And his deportation.
in his everyday kind of demeanor and the way he spoke. He didn't use a rhetoric of hate to do these things at all. What
was
we
smart.
have now is a man who uses a rhetoric of hate and violence. And in some ways, your enemy. And I think that there's no camouflage for what we are up against with him.
Yeah.
And so, I do hope that will mean that people that might otherwise not be politicized will get politicized. And I know there's been a lot of criticism of white women going to their first march on the, for the Women's March. And, I know some people that, never pay attention to politics who got out and went to that march. And I think it's fantastic. And I mean, I hope that they, that this is a first of many steps. Because we need as many people mobilizing from as many different places as possible.
And we shouldn't exclude the Trump supporters, because I think we need to approach them with
Absolutely,
magnanimity and with aloha, and to basically talk to them about, on a very even, respectful keel about and try to understand why they voted for him, and also, and I think, already I can see that it's beginning to peel off some of the layers. I mean, some people have been, they're thinking about these billionaires like, Rex Tillerson and others, who are being nominated for these cabinet posts, and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, I thought this guy was against the elites, and this will continue that. But to me, the question is, at one point, there's going to be it may be more gradual, but there will be a real disaffection from among Trump voters with Trump. They will see him for what he is. And at that point, it's a very dangerous point, I think, because at that point, they may move even more extreme to, the alt-right or people who are promising white nationalist solutions to the country's dilemmas, or else we may be there. And we may be there to basically answer a lot of their questions and to provide programs that they could get behind. And I think that's going to be
I
a
saw
cool
a
move.
Twitter feed in response to this wall that Trump is intent on building with this price tag of $20 billion, I think is the estimate for the wall. And, you know, Mexico is like, hell no, we're not paying for your wall. And why would they? But there are some Trump supporters that are using language I will not use on television about the wall and about, you know, they're not liking the idea of being footed this huge bill all of a sudden. And so I do think that, you know, there is going to be a huge feeling of betrayal and backlash for some of his supporters. What form that will take, I think you're right, it's hard to know. When I was in Denver for the American Studies Association, and it was immediately after the election, it was just a few days after the election, and I was walking down the street close to the hotel, and there were some black girls who I think had just gotten off school, and they're joking, they're horsing around, going down the street, having a good time, and this elderly woman in a wheelchair starts screaming at them, go, you know, get out, this is my country now, and she's just screaming at them, and these girls turn and they're just like, why are you, what? and you know, one of them explained that they often give her money. But she's screaming and she's saying, I have my president now, you just get out of here. And things got very tense. And this woman got so upset that she was trying to heave herself out of her wheelchair. And if she had succeeded, I think she would have been seriously injured, if not fatally injured. And I was just thinking, do you think that Trump is going to take care of your health and, you know, has any respect for you as this elderly, wheelchair-bound woman? He's not your friend. And yet there was this rage and desire to blame problems on
a lot of emotions.
you know, on black people,
Yeah,
on
invested
black
in
youth.
that, yeah.
And so, you know, what's going to happen when that woman's wheelchair is not getting covered? I don't know that she's going to, that anything particularly good is going to happen. But I don't know. You know, I think we're at
But
this moment
is
where
a good example, yeah. But the thing, though, in terms of focusing on the question of why are we losing all these kinds of jobs and, you know, the state of affairs of the nation and so forth, we have to really analyze, etc. And the new movement will have to kind of organize these disparate kinds of initiatives. You know, like you know, the ones you mentioned, like Keystone Pipeline and indigenous struggles, and the women's struggles, and all of that. Bring them together, but that requires a lot of intellectual production and a lot of analysis and imagination and organizing.
Organizing America in a different way, perhaps detaching the whole notion of income from work. You know, which would be very powerful. I mean, that would you know, and basically people have a right to a basic income in this country. You know, which
I mean,
which
you
is
know,
not
in
a
many
bizarre-
countries, still, even like with this globalization, you don't pay for education, you don't pay for healthcare, etc. And these are poor countries.
well, I mean, the problem with work disappearing through technology is not that work is disappearing, it's that wealth is getting concentrated, right?
Absolutely,
because we have so naturalized the idea that we should work, you know, all the time. But actually, if we don't need to work all the time, and, you know, that's not necessarily a problem. What is a problem is that all the wealth is getting concentrated in so few hands. So I think what Noel is saying is really, you know, right. It takes reimagining things and not thinking we can or should reconstitute economies that we are actually not going to be able to reconstitute.
I remember in terms of wealth and the gap between rich and poor, as I remember, 10 years ago, there were 140 some billionaires. Now it's 500 plus billionaires. So just in 10 years, you know. So these are the general numbers, not the exact ones. But over 500 definitely now, you see. So that's like gap between rich and poor, etc. Jobs getting wiped out. And a lot of people think that Trump is going to bring the jobs back. How, you know, let there be jobs, you know, that kind of stuff. That's not going to happen because there's like all kinds of transnational corporations, etc. These are the ones. And what kind of incentives are you going to give them? Oh, they're paying over there, wherever there is, $1 an hour at best, you know. We'll have American workers work for $1 an hour. You know, I mean, what kind of incentive you're going to? Taxes, like don't pay taxes already. They're not paying much taxes, you know, and so forth. So there is little that he can do to bring these jobs back. A lot of workers are contingent workers, meaning like, you know, here now, gone to Maui tomorrow, you know, but also part-time jobs, right? 20 hours, 19 hours, etc. instead of, and making $15 an hour instead of like a job in a steel factory.
No healthcare.
Yeah, and no healthcare.
Yeah.
Instead of, you know, steel factory like $50 an hour or $30 an hour. So you can see what's happening. And Trump by himself or with his cronies, he's not going to be able to bring that back. So it's the question of, as you say, separate money from work and say that people are entitled to healthcare, education, you know, and all these good things. Mm-hmm. And the high technology, these guys shouldn't be controlling it. The people should be controlling it, you know. So this is the thing.
Defining what work is, right?
Exactly.
Because
yeah.
so much work is care work, for example.
Yeah.
So I think it's also
and a lot of
reconceiving
housework
what
is not being,
constitutes
yeah,
work.
you know,
also-
yeah.
Also, the
Housewife, what is she getting paid? She's not getting paid anything, right? She should be,
Right.
in my view.
domestic
right?
labor.
Yeah, it's domestic labor, unpaid, you know, just like at the mercy of her husband or her partner or whatever, you know. That's not good, you know. So all these things, a new movement can capture those kinds of ideas, begin to think about them and organize, to bring all people, including a lot of Trump people, into the thing. So the nature of globalization and capitalist production and robotics, etc., is what is bringing this kind of crisis. You know.
And we also need to basically imagine new ways of creating meaning for
Right.
people, meaning and community, which is, I think, really deviling this country in the sense of loss of community through the loss of meaningful work.
Yeah.
And to create meaning outside of the whole notion of work and then create new processes of sharing.
Yeah,
so that
and
we
work
can
as
build communities.
self-actualizing for human beings, give them identity, give them worth, give them all that kind of stuff. They can reflect and relate to the other person in terms of work when work is redefined, you know, and that's what needs to be done. It's a whole new vision, you
We
know.
need to reimagine ourselves as a country.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, at the same time as I, you know, very much agree with what you're saying, one question I have has to do with like the Richard Spencers or, you know,
Richard Spencers, yes.
the kind of, you know, Trump supporters who are the kind that I witnessed at the Women's March that were, and the march on Friday were yelling with the brown people I was with, go back to where you came from. And, you know, I don't particularly want to include those people.
I mean, yeah. I mean,
And-
they would define themselves out of the process, but at least there's a lot of people whom you can attract. I mean, this is like from history, we can say, like in Nazi Germany, for instance. You know, the Nazis were fighting for the same turf as the communists were fighting, you know, for the workers. The communists couldn't get the workers. The fascists did it because they had simple solutions like build a wall, do this, you know, that kind of stuff. So people go and get attracted to it. And nationalism helps in moving people to one side rather than the other. I mean, that's the other thing. Yeah.
Did you see that Trump today announced he's going to keep a list of immigrants who have committed crimes,
Yeah, on his
running.
Twitter.
which Hitler did.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There you go.
Registry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
registry.
yeah.
I mean,
When I hear the term registry, I
yeah.
really start thinking 1938.
Yes.
You know, this is
We're nowhere in a bad place when Madeleine Albright is unhappy.
Yeah.
Like,
She's the
Madeleine
former
Albright,
state.
who was happy to have 500,000
yeah.
Iraqi children
Yeah,
die
yeah,
for the
yeah.
lie of weapons of mass destruction,
She's the
right?
former
She's
state
going to be the
secretary
first
under
to
Clinton.
register herself as Muslim.
So, I mean, this is very, very interesting. I mean, this registry and all of that. So, but the question of like this crisis and what's happening since 2008, the global financial crisis, is that there was a merger, direct merger between the corporations and the state that happened in this country through what Bush gave them, you know, and then Obama gave him even more billions, you know, rather than give to the people to spend, you know, so that they can shore up the economy. He gave it to the corporations, etc. And now you can see, like, in terms of all kinds of things, the merger between the corporation and the state. You see the policies and all of that. So that's, I mean, the classic definition of what fascism is. And, you know, for instance, the Patriot Act, etc., trying to bring the politics to, in support of fascism, etc., to the fore. Now with Trump, it's taking even a faster track, you know, or it's on a track that is going faster to do those kinds of politics, etc. And I remember his acceptance speech, like, you know, his victory speech, when he says, we have won, and this is not a campaign, this is a movement, you know. So he's talking about a movement that we're gonna organize even more than it is organized. So he's talking about the fascist movement. So here, all the more reason for a new kind of politics, progressive politics, to begin to talk about the things we were talking about and move away from the Republicans and the Democrats, you know, I think, you know, and not let the Democrats take, you know, this and derail it to their own track, you know, to rebuild the party or something. I think this is wrong. I mean, it shouldn't happen. It would be a crime against the people of the United States. So we spent quite a bit of time on the domestic politics, which I think is very important because domestic politics in many ways defines foreign policy and so forth. And so foreign policy, Trump, how did it happen with you? How did you see Trump working? The first 2-3 days, you know, of his presidency.
I think that his ignorance is quite terrifying, and the evacuation of people that know what they're doing, even if I might not like what they're doing, from the State Department is really unsettling. And I think that he seems to float ideas that he doesn't understand and doesn't care that he doesn't understand them. It's almost like, let me float this and see what happens. You know, an example of that is moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, where I just think that, I mean, maybe he does understand how potentially explosive a move that would be, because I think that would be completely catastrophic in terms of what it would spark. Does he know that? I don't know. Does he care? No, probably not, unless it I feel that what he seems to care about is his fortune and his image and getting attention. And so I think it's a very volatile situation. I have no idea what to expect. I think it's much less known to me than his domestic policies, just because his lack of experience and his disinterest in surrounding himself with people who understand and know what to do is extraordinary. Yeah. It's I think quite terrifying.
Yeah, but the thing in terms of like what you said about the moving of the embassy is really telling in terms of where his ideology is taking him, and also his relationship with Zionism. I mean, it's very important. Zionism meaning two things: the ideology that drives, you know, all these kind of Zionists. They don't have to be Jewish, you know, but Zionists in support of the State of Israel that was created in 1948 in geographic Palestine. His relationship to them, even Kushner, his son-in-law, I mean, he's a Zionist par excellence, supports the settlements, the colonies in the State of Israel and the West Bank and, Gaza before that. But anyway, and they gave money, Kushner, his family gave money to build more settlements or more units in settlements, So this is very interesting. So it tells us where he might be going, or,
I mean, I think Israel is special to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in fact, I still remember this statement he made when he was campaigning. He said, when I am president, Israel will no longer be a second-class citizen, which I thought was a really extraordinary statement coming from a man who seems interested in expunging all kinds of people who are citizens to say no longer. And the no longer when we are actually funding Israel to the tune of 38 billion for the next 10 years, an increase, right? And then this idea that Israel is part of our country, is our citizen. That to me speaks volumes about the way that he approaches Israel. And I mean, I think the thing that will be very interesting under Trump, I mean, I think most of it is not interesting and is just terrible, in terms of giving a carte blanche to building settlements, to annexing the West Bank, to doing whatever Netanyahu wants to do. The part that I think is going to be interesting to see in the U.S. is that because he has surrounded himself with people who are Zionists as well as white supremacists, as well as anti-Semites in some cases, I wouldn't say Kushner, but someone like Bannon. That's an interesting kind of exposure to something that the three of us and many other people have been long saying, which is that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are two entirely different things. And in fact, Zionism is compatible with anti-Semitism and in its present form is a form of white supremacy. And I think in terms of the other kind of unmasking that we have, or one of the many kinds of unmaskings that we have right now, one of them is that Zionism is racist, that Zionism is perfectly compatible with anti-Semitism.
Yeah, before I go to Noah, just a few days ago, Noah and I were talking. I came to his office and said, Obama Trump is going to get rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, but now he is on the TTP, which is the Trump Twitter presidency. Because, it tells you short attention span, and he can explain everything on Twitter, and why should I worry about things? I let other people do the work. And I work as though I'm still the CEO and the owner of this huge corporation, real estate, and all of that. So, Noel, about his, since we're talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what is he doing in terms of globalization?
Well, I'm just thinking of this America First movement which he's putting out, and if anybody out there remembers, America First was an organization formed during the 30s, which basically was a fascist organization. And so, I mean, I'm thinking, I wonder if they selected this with any kind of historical knowledge. But I think if you read the Guardian, any foreign newspaper, basically, or if we have friends, I'm sure all of us are getting letters from and emails from friends about what is going on there. What he's done has basically horrified and alienated our allies, and he's threatening to leave NATO. He's threatening to do all these kind of things, which basically his Russian connection. All of this really has alarmed people who've been our friends, for decades, and have been our allies. So this is he's basically undermining our position throughout the world, making America a laughingstock. I mean, this whole notion of American exceptionalism, that we're the country that we have a different course in world affairs, has been totally shattered by this election. But what You know, what really worries me at a really visceral level is the fact that is his relationship, his very hostile relationship toward the Chinese. We've had all these incidents in the South China Sea, which you know have you know we've had people like Obama and others have handled this in a very moderate way and tried to play it down and tried to make overtures to the Chinese. I don't see this coming from Trump at all. He's he's as friendly as he is to Putin and the Russians. He's hostile to China. And any kind of if there's a major incident in the South China Sea, what happens then? Are we talking about a nuclear war? I mean, so I'm really, I regard this with a lot of trepidation.
Yeah,
A lot of
yeah.
I'm very anxious about this because I don't trust his instincts. He's installed Kelly and various other people in the Defense Department of Banyan and others who are really notorious hawks. And very belligerent, very aggressive foreign policy specialists. I don't trust their instincts or their intelligence either. So I'm really sort of looking at the future with a lot of anxiety. I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't think Trump has any. I mean, when he was just Donald Trump, it was bad enough. But now he's become the most powerful man in the world, and he has immense resources of power to mobilize against people he regards as his enemies, or people who cross him. And he's got this very fragile ego, which needs to be constantly fed. And his rhetoric and everything else indicates he wants to destroy his enemies. And all of this makes me very uneasy.
Yeah,
frankly.
before when he was like on that program, when he would tell somebody you're fired, that's okay. I mean, but when he tells that to a missile, you're fired now, it's a problem because that's World War. I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just really bad. But I want to connect two things together: his foreign policy with also the people he has chosen, like you talked about, Bannon, you talked about Kelly and Mattis also the defense, and so on. You look at it, at these guys, and you see like someone is against Russia, another guy is okay with Russia, even like Trump is saying that, we're gonna deal with Putin and be friends and fight Daesh, which is ISIS, and so forth. But at the same time, you see, in terms of, if you look at Russia, and the strategy is like Russia and China together, and then you look at Henry Kissinger, who is, sometimes advising Trump, Henry Kissinger's main point in terms of strategic point is to separate China from Russia, okay? Now, the Russians are not that stupid to fall for it, but I hope they don't make a mistake, not for their sake, but for the sake of the world, and not do that, you know what I'm saying? So it is interesting to see like the contradiction in his policies, but something that might seem as a contradiction, it might be like some kind of a diabolical kind of thing, a la Kissinger, to try and do something that really wipes out the other side in one way or another. So these are dangerous things. But he talks like Trump about NATO and all of that, no good and so on. But now he says, no, you guys have to pay for it, the Germans and the rest of these guys. And it's interesting to me, the media, they don't say anything about that really, except repeat what Trump is saying and say, yeah, they should pay for it because we are defending them. Not thinking or reflecting on one thing, which is actually, why are there, I don't know how many, 700 US bases and installations abroad? Is it to protect Japan and Germany, etc., or to have the US dominate the global system, okay? And so it is for the protection and domination of the US for the global system. And then, in fact, the Germans should take money from the U.S. to keep the bases there, for instance, or the Japanese, Okinawans, for instance, and so on. So what do you think about these kinds of critiques, of the question of, for instance, Trump, we want them to pay for the defense that we are providing, so we're doing you a favor, what do you think?
I will quickly say it reminds me a little bit of calling the Israeli army the IDF, or
defense,
Israeli
yeah.
Defense Forces, when in fact they're an occupying force.
exactly.
That's a quick answer to what you have to say.
That's good, yeah.
I've been concerned for a long time with, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that the United States sort of moved into that vacuum and established and included, Lithuania and Poland and various other countries in NATO, and basically formed this sort of ring around, the reconstituted Russia.
Yeah.
And this is, to me, this has always been a flagrant, as much as I dislike Putin, this has been a flagrant provocation to the Russians, and that whole a president who had any sort of intelligence or was intent on maintaining the peace would basically dismantle that whole system of alliances and pull it back into Western Europe, even if we
But
needed
that
it
would
at
be
that point.
working against the transnational corporations. Many of them are, U.S. corporations with, tentacles all over the world, etc. In terms of finance and also in terms of production and oil, and all of that. You see, so there is this kind of problem with that, and also like reflecting on Russia, China, and his politics, foreign policy, the Middle East begins to loom large, given like the question of the state of Israel and Palestine and so forth. From what he's doing now, there would be more problems and more wars in the Middle East, and the conflagration. There's a high probability of it flaring up much more so than what we have now, and what we have now is horrific.
Yes.
It's just really bad. So this is all the more reason for why a progressive movement has to take two prongs to it, like the domestic and the foreign, and also to see the relationship between the two. Any ideas?
Well, these bans on who can travel or come to the U.S. are the precise people that we are responsible for bombing, right?
Absolutely.
So these things are absolutely connected in the same way that I think the kinds of support that he's offering to Israel is tied to the kinds of repressions that I think we're going to see more and more of against people that speak on behalf of Palestine here, or that speak critically of Israel. So I see these things as very connected. And Stephen Salaita said the other day that Palestine is something to watch because it will be the kind of indicator, the first indicator of what's going to be happening. And I think he's quite right about that.
And also Trump now revisiting the question of CIA black sites, to open those ones, or to reopen them. That's very interesting. Any final comments? No.
We were just talking about the CIA. It's interesting that he, one of his many lies has been when he visited the CIA and managed to tell the CIA people that he had never really spoken against them, or So it's he lives in his own world of fantasy, and it's extremely dangerous having our leader who can't recognize reality from fantasy.
Good. Sorry we ran out of time. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for watching. And see you next month. Mahalo nui loa. Aloha.